Mcebisi Jonas will address that gathering. Now, while we're waiting for that to start, we're joined in studio by political analyst Ibrahim Fakir and Dr. Sarah Kinski from the Wits School of Governance. Gentlemen, let me thank you both for coming in. Another busy weekend for ANC leaders, saying quite a bit. The latest, Fikile Mbalula saying this morning that factionalism has now created a new kind of cadre, as it were, who sees infighting as an acceptable means to an end. What do you make of that?
Well, it's not surprising, but it's not new either. This factionalism that Mbalula is talking about has been going on since 2004, 2005, so close on to a decade and more. There's been factionalism while the ANC has been in government or as a governing party. But there's been factions in the ANC before that too. Even before the ANC took the mantle of government in 1994, it was slightly factionalized in the sense that there were different factions which saw a different vision for South Africa. But at that time they had a manufactured consensus. They had a common purpose, which was to get rid of the apartheid state, to see through the transition, to win the first election and subsequent elections, obviously. And so the factionalism was in part based on ideas, wasn't always based on a colonization or an attempt to colonize resources. And now you've got this added kind of cleavage, so to speak, because back then, though you may have broken down on the basis of ideas, now you layer onto ideas, policy ideas, political ideas, the idea for position, the idea to be politically elected, both in the party and in the state, but also to be able to command and the ability to sort of get into positions which allow you to influence the awarding of tenders and procurement and making decisions of that nature.
However, Ibrahim points out that factionalism in the ANC is nothing new, goes back well over 10 years, but has it worsened, or is there just more of a focus now on the internal ructions in the ANC?
Well, the stakes are so much higher now because it's a contest of different groups inside the ANC for the heart and soul of the ANC. And one sees this very clearly in terms of the different understandings of ANC tradition that the different groups put forward. So before collective leadership, suddenly the leader of the ANC can make decisions outside of consultations with the top leaders of the ANC. And if you go public, now you seem to be breaking ranks with the ANC. So there's a fundamental fragmentation of the ANC, and it's now a contest for that leadership. And the tradition and the rules are being invoked. And the clearest example of that is the tradition of the deputy president taking over the leadership. And now all of a sudden we need a woman leader of the ANC, and that's a break of traditions. We can't have a show of hands, we can't have secret ballots in NEC meetings because it's not ANC tradition. So all of these things are feeding into the political conflict, and the sides use these traditions and they distort these traditions and they make up new traditions in terms of the power struggle that's going on. So where's this all leading to? If people in an organization can't agree on what the tradition of the organization is, the chances of a split increase dramatically. And I think that's what we're looking forward to in the next year at least.
And I'm wondering then, Ibrahim, about Cyril Ramaphosa, because when he was elected to the deputy presidency, he was seen as largely someone who'd come in on a Zuma ticket as well at the time. Where and when did things change for him, now that we see him seemingly out of the fold, as it were?
Well, I think sort of things looked different sort of almost immediately after Mangaung. Because I think the idea was that we'd get onto this ticket, defeat the other side. But I think there may also have been a lingering legacy of thought which says we've got to mix up the top six at least, and at least have someone who's considered of the right mind to be somewhere in the top, at least in the state. And so I thought that may have been the thinking. But I think pretty soon after, so if you start thinking about January, February 2013, which is immediately after the December 2012 Congress, Mangaung Congress, you could already see a different kind of vision being espoused by Ramaphosa. And it almost appeared as if, at least in the state, if not in the ANC, Ramaphosa was playing more of a prime ministerial role, so taking all the actual government decisions and government work which had to be done, whether it was fighting fires on the continent, whether it was looking after BEE, whether it was talking about the unions, and then of course you had Marikana in the mix, which obviously happened before the Mangaung Congress. But you know, I think that sort of difference was evident from before. But again, it's not something which happened only after the Mangaung Congress. If you think about the conference in 2007, and you had someone like Matthew Sposa, who was elected as the Treasurer General. It's almost the first Treasurer General who I found so soon after a conference starting to make all kinds of policy pronouncements. So it appears as if what's been happening in the ANC, at least from 1994, is that come every elective Congress or conference of the ANC, is that there's a like mind of people who get together to be on a particular slate or ticket, so to speak, and once they achieve that kind of minimal goal of just getting elected or getting into position, things start to break down sooner and sooner and sooner after they actually appear to be of like mind. Now it appears as if Ramaphosa, almost like a pendulum, swung away, but as himself recently started talking about radical economic transformation. So his speech to the Black Business Council a couple nights ago was also invoking the idea of radical economic transformation. But like I was suggesting, even though the rules and the traditions of the ANC are being contested, now even the concepts themselves are being contested, because his posture on what radical economic transformation is appears radically different and fundamentally different from what others say when they talk about radical economic transformation.
And what would this radical economic transformation look like, Ivor? Because the president is saying one thing, yet other leaders are saying another. I mean, you look at Malusi Gigaba, when he came in as finance minister, he was also walking sort of along the same line, and then now, just a few days before his investor road trip, he seemed to have changed or softened his tune somewhat.
Yes, it's a highly contested term, and different factions and groupings are going to present it in different ways. The fact of the matter is that South Africa's economy has to be transformed. There's no issue there in terms of that statement. The policy complexities of that are really important. So the one side wants to focus on state resources, especially government procurement, in terms of empowering a new black business class and to strengthen existing black business people. And a good case could be made for that, as long as it's compliant with the Constitution in competitive procurement and it complies with Treasury prescriptions on how that's going to work. There's not an issue there. The concern is that it's going to be abused and it's going to feed into the patronage politics that it seems to be associated with one grouping inside the ANC. So what Deputy President Ramaphosa said at the Black Business Council the other night was interesting, because he's saying all of that, but he's saying we're going to do that properly, by the book, in a transparent, accountable way, and we'll allow the market force to grow, to determine these issues, and we'll want a more competitive economic system as well, instead of just relying heavily on the state. And there's a realization that this emphasis on the state is problematic, because our state just can't deliver all the things people want it to deliver. We just don't have the technical and the institutional capacity to do that. So he's got a different approach, more market, more private sector, more incentives. The other group want to drive a radical economic transformation through the state, and the ineffectiveness of those institutions will certainly have a negative impact on that, should that position prevail.
Right, speaking of the Deputy President, Cyril Ramaphosa has come out batting for radical economic transformation, saying it must happen urgently. He was addressing, as we were saying just a short while ago, a black business gathering in Sandton earlier in the week.
The call for radical economic transformation seeks to address precisely these fundamental issues. And even if some people want to interpret this issue of radical economic transformation in a number of ways, and they ascribe different meanings to the term radical economic transformation, all I can tell you is that this term, radical economic transformation, it has substance and it has meaning, and it has relevance, and it is urgent, and it must be done now, because our people expect that.
Let's pick up our conversation there, Ibrahim. Cyril Ramaphosa talks a good game, some are saying, as far as radical economic transformation is concerned, but others are saying he's the last person to push for such a policy when he is seen as part of a very small elite group that has benefited from the country's economy since 1994. So how does his messaging then fare with both members of the ANC and the general public as we work towards that ANC conference?
But this is precisely what is at contest that I was talking about. So if you fracture the way in which the two different sides, or I think now even three or four different sides are thinking, what Ramaphosa is suggesting is a continuation of the trajectory of what I would call economic change, or at least deracialization of the economy, particularly at the upper echelons. And so he invokes things like the set-asides, which are not very different from things like PEE, because if you think about the new prescriptions that the ANC is suggesting in terms of government procurement, they are saying 30% of all big infrastructure and construction projects should go to black business and for small, medium and micro enterprises. So that's his one approach. Continue the trajectory that we've seen over the past little while. The other side says, whoa, hold on, that doesn't in fact work. What we need to do is change the Public Finance Management Act and the Municipal Finance Management Act, because those things are a hindrance. So they're saying, question the entire regulatory infrastructure as we have it at the moment, while the other one is saying maintain that regulatory infrastructure because we haven't used it sufficiently. Our failures perhaps have been the inability and the inefficiency and ineffectiveness with which we've used all of the instruments which are available to us. So that's the one issue. You take a second issue like land, and I think the one side, the Ramaphosa side, if you want to call it that, might suggest that we've got these instruments, you've got a whole regulatory infrastructure around land restitution, land redistribution, land reclamation, and the Constitution is not itself a hindrance to the way in which these things should work. The other guys say, sorry, it doesn't work that way. The Constitution is far too protective of minority, and particularly minority property rights, and therefore we should get rid of what they call the property clause in the Constitution. So two fundamentally different approaches to the way in which they take this. So what's at in contest? I mean, all the ethics and his own, Ramaphosa's own hypocrisy aside, what is at contest is fundamentally an ideological and a political and policy difference. Now, whether the one side is using this difference as a mask for some kind of accumulation project, that of course is what everyone is saying. They're saying that these guys are using this radical rhetoric, so to speak, as a mask for primitive and primary accumulation of one set of actors. And they say, but the guys who are supporting a continuation of the trajectory at the moment are the guys who benefited. They want to protect their benefits and want to increase the circle in very small incremental ways. So fundamentally what we're facing now is a question in policy terms of what kind of rupture do you need in order to accelerate social change. And the one set of people are saying, but that's what we want. We want social and economic change. The other one says, we don't want change. It's too incremental. It's too reformist. We want a fundamental rupture and we want a revolutionary change. But they don't, as I was pointing out, question why, if the state has had so many instruments at its disposal, and in areas where it's got complete scope and control, municipalities, public health, public education, and the welfare services sector, how come they've been so inefficient and ineffective in prevailing over the very areas that they precisely have complete control over? So why should we trust that if you give them more scope, they'd be able to actually do what they say they're doing?
Right, we'll continue our conversation about the state of the ANC in 2017 as the party works itself towards the policy conference in June and that elective conference at the end of the year with Sarah Kinski as well as Ibrahim Fakir with me in studio this afternoon. But for now, let's take a short break.
For all football news and views.
Because those 55,000-seater stadiums are a vacuum. To create an atmosphere there, no matter how well you play, is always difficult.
Local and international.
I think we need to be cautious that we don't cause or we don't stumble and fall.
It's your one-stop football catch-up. Ishibobo, Saturdays on eNCA.
Welcome back. With the South African Communist Party in Uitenhage is holding a memorial lecture in honor of Chris Hani today. Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa and former Deputy Finance Minister Mcebisi Jona is expected to address that gathering. We are continuing now our conversation with political analyst Ibrahim Fakir and Dr. Sarah Kinski from the Wits School of Governance. And I want to come to you then, Dr. Sarah Kinski, and talk about this clear battle really between Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma and Cyril Ramaphosa. Now, Dlamini Zuma was out of government for a while. Now she's back, and some are saying we're seeing who she really is, or she is becoming at this point, with her more radical stance on a number of issues in the country. Which is it?
Well, she's the front-runner candidate for the ANC Women's League, the Youth League, and powerful groupings inside the ANC, NEC, and other committees in the ANC. So it's easy to deduce that she's the candidate that the Zuma camp wants to succeed President Jacob Zuma. So that's pretty obvious. So her track record at the AU, mixed to bad. The reviews aren't that good. Her record in South African government, Minister of Home Affairs, pretty good. Did a good job there. Minister of Health prior to that, the Sarafina scandal, that will re-emerge, I'm sure. So like many officials, some successes, some failures. Will she be able to convince large numbers of people inside the ANC that she's the right candidate? That remains to be seen. And the problem is that we're not having a head-to-head contest. In other contexts, you've got party leaders who competing for leadership, having public debates, going around the country selling their message. We don't see that explicitly. We see it overtly. We see it in a distorted way as people use funerals and other occasions to campaign. And in campaigning, they deny they're campaigning. So we don't have a clear process to assess the effect, the impact, and the power that these candidates have. What's very concerning in terms of the state itself, irrespective of which candidate comes through, is the vacancy for the Chief Procurement Officer. So the Chief Procurement Officer in Treasury determines the thresholds for BEE and other deals. So small business can't compete, so there's a threshold of leniency. So the political leadership coming in is going to have a large say on who the new Procurer General is. That's a red flag. There's some important positions that are now vacant in the technical team inside Treasury. Those appointments are up for grabs now. So this contest isn't just about policy and power of factions. It's about how Treasury is going to be shaped post-2019, and this is where the rating agencies, this is where investors, this is where citizens need to be very careful, because if you're going to pay 30-40% more for procurement just to empower black business, that's inflationary. That's taking money from schools and houses and feeding schemes to build up this business class. You're not getting value for money, and that's the concern. That's split right through these two camps. Taxpayers must pay for empowerment of new business, and the other camp saying we've got to do this prudently and manage it in terms of economic efficiencies. And that's why the leadership contest between Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, Cyril Ramaphosa, and many others whose names are now emerging is so important for the future prospects of economic stability in the country.
We're almost out of time, and I want to ask you this, Ibrahim, before we go. Is it too soon at this stage, based on the rhetoric that we've heard from both sides, to gauge who is the stronger candidate at this point?
I think it's almost impossible to tell. And you know, I mean, any speculation is going to be exactly that, speculative, because You can make deductions about who appears and whose rallies are bigger and who gets bigger applauses and all of that kind of business. But ultimately, it will come down to the actual voting patterns when the ANC convenes. One early indicator before has been kind of the resolutions which are sponsored by one or other side at the National General Council. And if you can gauge the level of support for particular papers and particular resolutions, you might be able to call it. But I think it's pretty close now. But, you know, the idea that there will just be this competition between the two is also now coming into question, because there's other voices in the ANC which are saying, look, we're at a point of such great peril that there might in fact be what Iva was talking about earlier, the precipitation of a split. And to avoid that split, perhaps what we need is a unified slate, so to speak. But whether they can actually reach consensus around that unified slate doesn't appear to me a real prospect, because what will happen now is that the credentials will come into question, who's voting delegates, which branches are accredited, are they bogus branches? So all of those fights are yet to come.
All right, Brian Fakir, Dr. Sarah Kinski, thank you so much for coming in this afternoon.